So listen to this. In 2021, Aubameyang got a phone call warning him that his mother had just been rushed to the hospital after suffering a stroke. He informed the club that he needed to fly to France and they gave him a 24-hour window to return, but upon seeing the state she was in, he decided to wait for the following morning and fly her to London alongside him. It was all fine. At first, he made it in time for the team meeting, everything, but then he was surprised by the fact that, due to the COVID regulations at the time, this delay meant he'd have to miss their next match. It was understandable to most, but for Arteta, well, he brought him into a private room, berated him for sticking a knife in the club's back, and proceeded to publicly humiliate him by stripping him of the captain's armband and then froze him out of the squad. We were talking about a player who was one of the most beloved characters in that team, both by the players, the staff and the fans, not to mention one of the deadliest strikers on the planet. A guy that had been averaging a goal or assist every 102 minutes, almost one per game, for 9 straight seasons, right up till the day that Arteta arrived. At one point, Aubameyang was regarded as one of the top 10 best players in the world, with Dortmund claiming he could run a 30-meter dash quicker than Usain Bolt, the fastest man that ever lived. Multiple newspapers naming him as the heir to Henry's throne, but from that day on, his career was never the same. In Aubameyang's words, "I never expected that from him. He killed me." Aubameyang had grinded his way to the top for year after year, going undetected by most fans up until the age of 25, and overnight, Arteta robbed him of his legacy as one of the sport's all-time greatest late bloomers, tarnishing his image forever. You see, most people don't realize this, but Aubameyang started as an AC Milan reserve player, training among Ronaldo, Inzaghi, Pato, Pirlo, Kaká, Seedorf, Maldini and Cafu, not because they thought he was that great of a talent, but because his father worked for them as a scout. A job that he got after he missed a plane and out of sheer luck ended up hitching a ride with Ariel Braida, AC Milan CEO, who upon finding out that this random man had actually not just played in the French first tier, but also captained the Gabonese national team to their first ever African Cup of Nations, ended up offering him a job, which pretty much allowed him to fast-track all of his kids into the club. First came Catilina, then Willy, and finally Pierre Emerick. But seeing how Willy had wasted years putting up some great numbers for their academy, even scoring the winning goal against Juventus at the final of the Coppa Lombardia, only to eventually be sent away with only a handful of senior appearances. When Aubameyang himself was offered his first professional contract, instead of holding on to the idea that he'd one day make the first team, he demanded to be loaned out, ending up at Dijon, being coached by Begic, one of his father's old teammates, and for a while that seemed like a good decision. Aubameyang put down 10 goals on his debut season despite being only 19. By summer, he was featured on World Soccer magazine as he signed a new loan deal with an option to buy at Lille. He was even receiving call-ups to both the French and Italian under-21 national teams, but instead, he decided to follow the legacy of his father, joining the far less glamorous Gabonese national team, where years later, during the 2012 Olympic Games, he was photographed practicing alongside them in a public park. Regardless, at Lille, Aubameyang struggled to shine through in a team that was dominating the league with young talents like Eden Hazard and Gervinho, so after a year, Milan moved him out to Monaco where hopefully the competition would be a bit lighter, but instead, they quickly succumbed to the bottom of the table, and once a new manager took over, Aubameyang was again sent back to Milan with his tail between his legs, asking for one more chance. And that was the year that changed everything. Already 22 years old, representing his fourth club in the space of a year and a half, and seemingly bound to follow his brother's footsteps towards mediocrity, Aubameyang arrived at Saint Etienne shortly after receiving the news that he had a baby on the way. So as he said it himself, hearing that I was going to be a father was what made it all click for me. I wanted him to be proud of me, to be his hero just as my father was mine. Still, 5 months later, though his form had improved, manager Christophe Galtier was still unsure, but upon noticing that he had spent the entire summer holidays at their training grounds practicing drills over and over again, he decided he deserved one proper chance, a full year. And in his own words, when he arrived at pre-season, he wasn't the same man, he had become a war machine. By December, they were already calling up Milan to make the transfer permanent. Up till then, Aubameyang's record tally set at 4 goals in a year, but on that one, he hit 18 goals, the most by a Saint Etienne player in 14 years, not to mention his 8 assists. It was so incredible, the fans barely noticed the departure of their star player Dimitri Payet. As one teammate said, "Our whole game was winning the ball and getting it up the pitch as quickly as possible. We didn't even need to be precise. Aubameyang was so fast, he'd always be the first one to get to it." Before you knew it, he was showing up to matches with diamond-encrusted boots, celebrating his goals with a Spider-Man mask in honor of the legendary Jeremy Janot, and balling out at the African Cup of Nations, single-handedly dragging Gabon to the knockouts for the first time in their history, scoring or assisting in every single game. And even if it all ended up in tears as he missed the penalty that would send him out of the tournament, he'd still finish as its top scorer, and next season, he'd be hitting 31 goal contributions, running off the pitch like Gareth Bale, scoring with kung fu style kicks and backheel volleys like Zlatan Ibrahimovic. Matter of fact, he was the only one to outscore him in the whole league. By the end, Aubameyang had his team in 5th place, their best in 25 years, and worse, despite both his house and his car being robbed the day of the final of the League Cup, he still assisted the winning goal as he led them to their first trophy in 32 years. Since the time of Platini, Saint Etienne had not seen a player of this caliber, and everyone was after him: Man United, Newcastle and Man City. But instead, he signed with Dortmund not just because Marcus Royce and company had just reached the Champions League final, but because he had watched Klopp turn Lewandowski into the best striker on the planet, and he wanted that for himself, even if theirs wasn't by far the most lucrative offer, which was great thinking. Right on his debut, Aubameyang was already getting a hat-trick. By February, he had 16 goals to his name in just 17 starts. There were free kicks, acrobatic goals, you name it. The fans were already in love. He had even been made captain for his national team. But if the news that Lewandowski would be leaving at the end of the season seemed like a guarantee that Aubameyang was about to completely take over that squad, then they signed Ciro Immobile as his replacement. So Aubameyang had no choice but to outscore him to such a degree that it was just humiliating. By February, the Serie A's top scorer had just 3 league goals to his name, with Dortmund quite literally at the bottom of the table, bound for relegation as Jurgen Klopp announced that he'd be stepping down at the end of the season, only for Aubameyang to finally take over as their #1 striker and instantly go on a run of 14 goal contributions in the last 15 matches of the season, miraculously bringing them up to 7th place, managing to secure an Europa League spot when escaping relegation would have already seemed like a success. It was so embarrassing that by summer, Immobile was already getting shipped out of the club, while Aubameyang was being handed a new contract. And then, Tuchel came in, made Auba their star player, and he was instantly breaking records, becoming the first ever player to score in all of the first 8 matches of the Bundesliga. By the holiday season, he had only failed to score in 3 league matches, already closing in on a 30-goal mark. Not to mention that, then, he put 3 goals past Tottenham, another past Liverpool, contributed to 5 in the 3 games that led him to the cup final. By the end, it was 1 of 50 goal contributions. Forget Immobile, that was more than Lewandowski had ever managed at Dortmund. Aubameyang was both the Bundesliga's and the African Player of the Year, despite not winning any trophies. He was openly flirting with the biggest clubs in the world. Barcelona wanted him as a Pedro replacement. Benitez at Real wanted him to be his first signing. He was already being regarded as a top contender for the title of best striker on the planet. And then, he did it all again. He opened his year with 5 goal contributions in a single match, with a front flip celebration and a backheel assist to go alongside it. The next match, he gave Dortmund their first league win over Bayern in years. In the Champions League, he scored against Real twice, home and away, with an assist to top it all off at the Bernabeu and locking the top spot in their group. He was scoring hat-tricks in the knockout stage. He even clutched both the semis and the final to snatch the German Cup away from Bayern. In the words of Matthias Sammer, he had become a killer. As Ottmar Hitzfeld said, it was Dortmund's life insurance policy. He was 11th in the Ballon d'Or, the Bundesliga's top scorer, ahead of Lewandowski himself, with 40 goals for the season. And after PSG backed down, refusing to pay the monumental 80 million euros Dortmund were demanding for his signing, edging incredibly close to what would have been a world record transfer, Auba was forced to stay, even if his departure had been announced for the 3rd consecutive summer, leading one one newspaper to write that he had become a Dortmund legend, whether he wanted to or not. Regardless, having cleaned out his locker and said goodbye to his teammates already, Auba came back, put down 14 goal contributions over the next 14 games, and settled on a club record €63 million move to Arsenal over the winter market, which you could very easily argue wasn't a good decision. 2 months later, Wenger had decided to step down and retire for good, as the newspapers joked that Aubameyang was his parting gift. But well, what that really meant in practical terms is that with Aubameyang being forced to take on Henry's number 14 shirt, he had become the front man of a club that seemed bound to implode. But that's what made it all so impressive. Stepping foot into the Premier League for the first time in his life, not only did Aubameyang put down 14 goal contributions in those 14 games still under Wenger, but once Unai Emery took over, he went ballistic. Already on his way to 30 years old, he quickly led Arsenal on an 18-match unbeaten run, scoring 12 and assisting 3 in the process, making him at the time the record holder for the best minutes per goal ratio in Premier League history, somehow managing to not slow down too much until the end of the season, by which, despite falling ill for a full month and then being sidelined again after almost breaking his nose, he found himself in one of the tightest Golden Boot races in history, as both he, Mane and Aguero found themselves 2 goals off of top scorer Mo Salah with 1 match left, going up against Burnley and closing out that gap to become the first player in history to have won both the Bundesliga and the Premier League's Golden Boot, as the award would be shared between 3. Though, really, if you did the math, you'd find that at his rates, had Aubameyang played as much as Salah, he'd have scored 5 more goals than him. Still, that wouldn't be the only thing that wouldn't go his way that year. In the Europa League, after scoring 2 and assisting a third to perform a 3-goal comeback against Rennes, Aubameyang then put 5 goal contributions in a semi-final 7-3 demolition of Valencia, only to watch his team collapse in the final, conceding 3 goals in 12 minutes to end the trophy to their city rivals Chelsea. By the following season, 8 goals in the 8 opening matches were enough to make it seem like Unai Emery's Arsenal would stand a chance as long as they had Aubameyang. But less than a month later, they were already 5 games deep into another meltdown, and it was right then and there that Xhaka lost it, yelling at the fans to go F themselves, being stripped of the captain's armband, which was then handed to Aubameyang. This was a seriously bad omen. Ever since the 90s, barely anyone had managed to hold on to it for more than a season. Even the record was just shy of 3. A lot of fans believed it was cursed, and this time it wouldn't be any different. The very next game, Unai Emery had already gotten the sack, and by December, Mikel Arteta had arrived. Suddenly, Aubameyang was being pushed into the right wing, no matter how obvious his performances made it that he was far more effective either in the center or at most on the left. By February, after scoring a bicycle kick to put Arsenal in front in extra time, Aubameyang watched Olympiacos score in the 119th minute before missing an open goal that led them out of the Europa League. A month later came the pandemic. By the end of the season, he fell 1 single goal short of the Golden Boot, and despite the fact that he'd still managed to score all 4 of Arsenal's goals against Chelsea and Man City to clutch the FA Cup title, and that, aside from Lewandowski, no striker in the top 5 leagues had scored more goals than him over the previous 4 seasons, he still failed to find a move over summer, ending up instead renewing with Arsenal, and that's when it all went down. Already struggling to keep up his numbers as Arteta pushed him further and further into the wing. After the turn of the year, while out with Congo, Aubameyang contracted malaria, being hospitalized for the first time. In August, he tested positive for COVID. In December, the whole Arteta situation went down, and he was kicked out of the squad and forced to train alone until he left for the African Cup of Nations, where he ended up in the hospital again with a more severe case of COVID that ended up causing damage to his heart, which, as you can imagine, is a huge problem for a player known for his speed. But regardless, a month later, his contract had already been terminated. Once he joined Barcelona on a free deal, finally realizing his dream of playing in his mother's homeland, no one thought he could do much, but after averaging a goal contribution every 108 minutes for 6 months straight, he had Xavi calling him a gift from heaven. He was their first striker since Zlatan to score 5 in his first 5 games. He had scored a hat-trick against Valencia, put 2 past Real. Leaving really didn't seem to make any sense, but maybe it was the fact his house had again been robbed, being beaten in front of his children. Maybe it was the fact that his old friend Thomas Tuchel needed him at Chelsea, or of course, that Barcelona were so far deep into their financial problems that they needed to offload him to comply with financial fair play now that they were trying to bring in Lewandowski, but that was, again, an awful decision. 5 days after his arrival, Tuchel was sacked and the two barely even saw each other. Once Potter took over, even if Aubameyang scored or assisted in every single one of his first 4 games, he seemingly refused to give him 90 minutes, and by the new year, he hadn't even been registered for the UCL knockouts. After that, it was a matter of counting down the days till the transfer market opened, and though a return to Barcelona was in the cards, Aubameyang chose to go back to France, joining Marseille, where despite going through 4 managers in a year, he revived his form completely, hitting 41 goal contributions for the season, almost leading them to a Europa League final with 14 goal contributions in just 13 games, even becoming the competition's all-time top scorer, and again, seemingly making the fans forget that their star player Alexis Sanchez had left at the start of the season, though by summer, the 20 million euros a year the Saudi Pro League offered were just too good to say no to, so Aubameyang left them as well, moving to Al Qadsiya, his 5th club in 5 seasons, once and for all accepting that it was over.